Paris Live guest.
Let's begin with the editorial article, the opener of the December-January issue of the Africa Report, which is out now, and it's entitled "The New World Order and Africa." And in that article, you discuss how China has now established itself as a major trading partner for the continent, followed by India, Russia and Turkey. Could you maybe just sketch out what sort of investments, what sort of projects is China investing in?
I think China, in the main, over the last 15 years, has really concentrated on funding the hardware of development, the bridges, the ports, the railways, the power stations. Those really have been where most of the money has gone. Now, there's, of course, a multiplicity of other things, sports stadiums, clinics, etc., that people may have more in their mind. But I think most of the money has gone on these very big things, the dams, the railways, etc. And the idea that we were trying to drive at in this piece is to say, you know, there is a reconfiguration of the world happening. There's a book out a few years ago called Easternization, I think, just talking about the sort of the geopolitical, the geoeconomic center of the world being tugged towards Beijing, and Africa is obviously a big part of that. China has huge dollar reserves, and it also has all this idle capacity in its steel, its cement, and other construction industries, and it desperately needs to put them to work. Otherwise, Chinese people will be out of a job, and that's not very good if you're running a closed shop like the Central Party is in Beijing. So they're recycling that into places like Africa. So you're seeing new railways in Kenya and other investments elsewhere in the world. I think it's called the One Belt initiative currently, but it's a huge pot of money that they're very keen to put into infrastructure links across their trading routes, essentially.
But there are perhaps challenges and possibly dangers to do with this sort of investment.
I mean, there really are. That Kenyan railway I was talking about, which was completed a couple of years ago, is not making a return on the money invested, and there's a real risk that it will become a white elephant and not a productive piece of kit. Now, there has been a change really only in the last 18 months in Beijing, where they've started to realize not only can this be very costly for themselves, but it's also damaging for their image if they are starting to, inadvertently owning pieces of infrastructure by people defaulting on repayments. For example, there's a very famous port in Sri Lanka that's happened to. So there is better choice of projects and a bit more due diligence going into the sort of the business plans behind them. But I think what is really important is, with these multiplicity of new actors, you have the old spenders, as it were, the Europes and the US, being joined by China, but not just. You have Turkey as a new player. You have India, of course. You have Japan. You have lots of Asian powers now vying for bits of the Pacific coastal areas in Africa. The most important thing, I think, is for African policymakers to be able to, leverage all this interest against each other. So you don't have to take the first deal that comes through the door because, the Turkish contractor is offering me a much better deal. So my railway is going to be half that price. Have we seen that yet? Not everywhere, but in some places, certainly in Ethiopia, for example, a few years ago, they kicked out a Chinese telecoms contractor because they didn't, come up to scratch. They didn't complete what they said they were going to do on the deal. So they kicked them out and brought in Ericsson from Sweden, I think. And as a result, people now respect the Ethiopian administration much more. And as a result, hopefully, they get better deals on their dams and their railways.
Yes, it's getting more and more competitive. Moving on to Nigeria, you have an article in this edition. You're gearing up to keep tracking keep track of the elections that are in February. There's 73 candidates. Of course, the main ones are the President Muhammadu Buhari of the All Progressives Congress and Atiku Abubakar of the People's Democratic Party. Now, in your issue, you have an interview with Yemi Osinbajo, who is Nigeria's vice president, who trained as a lawyer. He's been out on the campaign trail, garnering support. He seems to be very convinced that grand corruption, as he calls it, has gone away, that it's been taken care of by the APC. What's your perspective on that?
That might be an over-optimistic casting of the situation to say that all grand corruption has gone away. Well, and what they have done, which I think has had an impact, and it's the kind of thing that people will look back in 10, 20 years' time and say, oh yeah, that really was a major change. The effects haven't really filtered out too much yet, but they have put all government spending, and this is a little bit of a boring technical accounting thing, but it isn't, the effects haven't really filtered out too much yet, but they have put they've put all government spending on something called the Treasury Single Account. So whereas before there were all these different pots of money semi-hidden from view sitting in departments or agencies or ministries, now everything has to be on the same budget line. So theoretically, at least, it's quite easy to see where the money is being stolen. And anecdotal evidence does suggest that that sort of government corruption, which is, a minister putting, a few million in his or her pocket, that has gone down. However, there are still politically linked individuals gravitating around the regime who are committing, I suspect, what might well be grand corruption. So I think there are certainly positives, but to say it's all gone away, I think, is a mistake.
Yeah. The other issue is, of course, the security, and that he also feels that the government has had certain success with containing the Boko Haram threat.
I mean, again, there is truth to it in the sense that whereas before Boko Haram could strike almost at will, it would seem, in the political capital, Abuja. Now they are restricted in their attacks to the northeastern section of the country. But, things are not looking great there. There has been a bit of a collapse in law and order throughout many parts of the north, some of which is related to Boko Haram, some of which isn't. It's just a failure of the state to extend the same level of protection to its citizens all across its territory.
And just quickly to wrap up for today, the other article I thought we'd have a look at is just the operations of the Morocco mining company OCP, which is bringing in a lot of money for the country.
That's right. It's I guess you might call it the cash cow of the kingdom. It is phosphate mining since for a few decades now, and it's really been what has allowed Morocco to spend so heavily on the infrastructure that has allowed its industrial renaissance to happen. So, if Renault bought a large plant and is now making cars in Morocco, it's in large part because they spent so much money on Tangier Med, and they spent so much money on a special center to train up workers in the auto sector. So it is being used for constructive things, that money, in the main. Nevertheless, it sits in a disputed territory. There are now thoughts that we are going to see a political deal in Western Sahara pretty soon. So fingers crossed. Yes,
they have to deal with the group, the Polisario Front, which claims part of this territory.
That's right, and it's been a struggle for sovereignty on their behalf now for several decades. It's something for which the Moroccan state is now extremely well known in the capitals around the world. They have a strong lobbying operation in Washington. They have a strong lobbying operation in Europe too. It's something that they really care about as a country. They are not, willing to grant sovereignty to Western Sahara. And it is one of the economic lungs of the country. So those two may be related.
Well, I'd like to thank you very much, Nick Norbrook from the Africa Report, the managing editor of the Africa Report, for coming into the studio today and having a chat with me. Thank you very much. And that edition, December-January issue, is out now to be read. Thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you.